It is my pleasure to introduce my good friend, Rusty Barceló, but her real name is Nancy. She has a whole story about that, who is president of Northern New Mexico College. Prior to her tenure at the college, she was vice provost and vice president for equity and diversity at the University of Minnesota and vice president and vice provost for minority affairs and diversity at the University of Washington. Born and raised in California's San Joaquin Valley, Dr. Barceló began her career as an educator, administrator, and diversity advocate at the University of Iowa, which, by the way, is where my son-in-law went, and she knew him. We found out last night, where she received her PhD in higher education administration. Today, she continues to work on both an institutional and national level as an educator, advocate, and spokesperson for equity and diversity in higher education. Among Dr. Barceló's publications is the Journal of Mujeres Activas, and one that is forthcoming, a chapter in a book by Silvia Altaro on diversity and institutional transformation in universities. Please join me in welcoming my good friend, Rusty.
Thank you.
I think that's yours, this one's mine.
What a day it's been. Y'all have worked me to death. But clearly there's some wonderful things that are happening at Fresno that gives me great hope for the future. So I'm really pleased to be part of it, and I hope that my remarks can add to the journey that you're on. I am from Merced, and as I've been saying most of the morning, it's really kind of emotional for me to be here, to come full circle, if you will, to come back to my roots, and to know that my grandmother is resting just 50 miles down the road in Merced. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I would be standing here one day. And in fact, this is the first invitation that has been extended to me to come to the Central Valley to share some remarks about my thinking around diversity. So it really is a pleasure. You know, let me just say before I get into my remarks, there's a number of publications that I'm involved in right now, so this presentation is kind of an amalgamation, if you will, of those different presentations, and so I hope it's not all over the place. But I do want to thank the President's Commission on Human Relations and Equity for inviting me to share some remarks addressing diversity and equity within the context of inclusion, a topic near and dear to my heart. And a special thank you to Dr. Krista Vieira, who worked with my office to ensure my participation, and that's not always an easy task. And Chris requested, based on his conversation with the Commission, that I speak to the difference of diversity and inclusion, to which I agreed, because of the confusion surrounding the terms, like do they mean the same thing? And as I thought about this, I realized they're not mutually exclusive, but must go hand in hand to achieve diversity and equity in higher education. So my talk will focus on these concepts as they relate to institutional transformation, something I've been hearing all day long. Simply put, though, to get at Chris's request, diversity is about inclusion. It's about making sure that all people have access to their fair share of the democratic and economic pie. It's about embracing multiple ways of knowing and being. It's about tapping into everyone's potential for creativity and productivity, and making sure that everyone has an opportunity to participate and contribute. Advancing diversity is the right thing to do, and especially in a free enterprise system like ours, it's also an economic imperative. My work is values-driven, and for me, equity, inclusion, and social and economic justice are core values. For me, diversity is first and foremost about fairness, about doing what's right. But it's also about dialogue and the free exchange of ideas. It's about innovation. It's about harnessing multiple perspectives and new ways of knowing and creating. And yes, it's about building and repairing our economy, not only for individuals, but also for the greater good of our institutions, our states, and our nation. At our institutions across the country, diversity is central to a new vision for change. It's part of the so-called new normal we keep hearing about. And yet I often find that the new normal isn't so new. The prevailing discourse in higher education may speak to institutional commitment, but it tends to stop there. For the most part, that commitment does not translate into a new agenda for change and comprehensive action on the ground. I don't see that happening here, though, at Fresno, based on what I've learned today. So let me put this in context by telling you a little bit more about me, and thank you, Alma, for that introduction. Now that I'm well into my third year as president of Northern New Mexico College, a predominantly Hispano-Indigenous college, 80% of our students are Hispano, 12% are natives. And it's really a very special institution. But I see more than ever the importance of the work I have dedicated my life to, creating inclusive academic and cultural spaces that express, support, and serve the needs of all communities. And some of the most important work I have done has been at the intersections of administrative work, teaching, scholarly work, and research, and community work. And as you might expect, the change from being a diversity officer to becoming a president is both exciting and unsettling. And I've been doing a lot of reflecting on both where I've been in my life and career and where I'm going. That's what happens when you get old. You know, the path to New Mexico is very much a natural extension of the journey I started decades ago. But I also can't know just where it will end or lead. I do know that the work of my life, advancing equity and diversity in the academy, will be as critical as ever in the years ahead, and perhaps even more so as we seek to serve the needs of our changing communities in an environment of new fiscal realities. When I consider how we create strategic change in such uncertain times, I can't help but reflect on the history of diversity in the academy. I think about where we began almost 50 years ago now, the struggles and the breakthroughs that brought us to this moment, and what we've carried with us and what we left behind. And I think about where our journey will take us in the years to come. What we've accomplished was unimaginable 40 years ago, but now it's time for us to work together in a new spirit of cooperation to harness our collective energies and develop a new agenda for change that will turn the new challenges we face into opportunities for institutional transformation. To do that, we all need to be multiculturalists. No one in the academy can afford to remain stuck in traditions and organizational models that no longer serve the 21st century academy, or to remain isolated in cultural or disciplinary silos. And that means going beyond the rhetoric of equity and diversity inclusion to truly embrace difference in theory and also in practice, in individual and also in collective action, in policies and programs and also in climate and attitudes around gender, race, and ethnicity, and also around sexual orientation, class, disability, and other differences among people with diversity in their job descriptions, and also a shared responsibility throughout the institution and by the numbers, but also in deep structural ways. It means reimagining diversity and equity as fundamental to everything we do in the academy and who we are in the academy. As I have been saying for the last several years, we live in a period of cultural and economic transformation that rivals the 1960s and the 1970s. And sad to say, we're still fighting some of the same old battles. And the tough new challenges we face include not only economic uncertainty, but also unprecedented demographic change and global political realignments. We also have a new generation of students who were born into the digital age and a new economy with new expectations and new global transnational perspectives. The impact on all of us and our institutions is profound. And for every one of these challenges, I think we have an opportunity to travel some roads never taken before. Together, working across institutional boundaries, we can form a critical mass of influence to shape decisions and investment priorities in the years ahead. I have seen far too many doors to opportunity and success closed or barely cracked open, and I've seen too many thresholds littered with unwelcome and discarded identities, left there by people whose only hope of entry and inclusion was to negate who they are. When we first stepped into the academic threshold nearly 5 decades ago, we were innocent, in a way. We thought we would be welcomed. We were admitted, after all. And we were quite frankly shocked when we realized that the territory we had entered was still off limits to us, and that the people already inside saw us as outsiders, intruders. In their view, if we wanted to be welcomed, if we wanted to succeed, we just had to stop being so, well, different. We were expected to behave as if we were just like them, as if our histories and identities didn't matter, as if we could just shrug off like a ratty old suit of clothes that no longer fit. But we didn't. We had no choice but to be who we were. And we came to realize that the only way to walk through those doors with integrity was to remain whole, to keep our identities intact, wear them proudly, with our heads high, our voices clear and authentic. We would need to become insiders, but with a difference. We would not, simply could not, play by the old rules. We would bring our outsiderness and our mismatched identities and ill-fitting narratives into the academy in a way that eventually transformed it. As change agents, we would challenge its existing structures and its hierarchies of merit, influence, and academic legitimacy, and we would create something new, an academy rooted in principles and practices of social, economic, and educational justice. I don't need to tell you that in some circles that made us subversive and dangerous. But we knew that academic activism was our only path if we wanted to do anything but preserve the status quo that had kept us on the margins for too long. In retrospect, I realized that it was always more than a sense of public mission that put me on the path I followed. My passion for social justice was rooted in my own identity and community, and in my own family history. For me, as many of my friends and colleagues, the call to service was deeply personal. It's not easy to create a culture of diversity, especially against powerful countercurrents of resistance, but I think that's what we have to do. And when I say culture of diversity, what I mean is a culture in which diversity is considered a strength and an educational and institutional asset, not a problem or an issue to be solved. It's a culture of open doors and barrier-free entryways. And beyond access, it's a culture that fully supports and affirms everyone's right to be and express who they are. It's a culture rooted in social justice as a positive value, one that is focused not just on the isms, the persistent biases and oppressions that divide and exclude, but on diversity as a resource, a rich source of talent and potential, and a catalyst for excellence that is fully aligned with the academic mission. It's a culture of shared responsibility, where equity and diversity are everyone's everyday work, and I saw that in the plan, not just designated work of a few who have diversity in their titles and job descriptions. And it's a culture of grounded in a set of values, principles, and lived experience that infuse everything from student access and achievement to inclusive multicultural pedagogies, from faculty recruitment and retention to diversity-centered reward systems and performance measures, from fundraising for capital projects to creating inclusive campus and community spaces that express support and serve the needs of all people. Clearly, this is not easy work. And for so many of us, it's important, but anything that's important often is hard to achieve. And there's nothing, though, quite so exhilarating as seeing that the finish line, though, is getting closer and closer as we do this work. We have a long way to go before the finish line, clearly. But I think one of the things that has helped sustain me, and I think other individuals, are our stories, our ancestors. And so if you haven't already figured it out throughout the day, you know I'm a storyteller, born into a storytelling culture. Our stories carry the weight and the inspiration of generations. They carry our legacy and define who we are. And those of us who have struggled to cross the threshold bring our stories with us. Their stories woven into and around our own keep their spirit and legacy alive, help keep us strong and whole. And as we navigate that new multicultural space at the border between inside and outside, what my dear friend and late writer, activist Gloria Anzaldúa called the borderlands, we learn from our stories that we are not alone, that we are a force to be reckoned with. And once we're inside, we begin braiding our stories into and through the dominant academic narrative. We introduce new threads, new characters, new ideas, new perspectives, and in doing that, we create a new multicultural reality, a kind of new narrative tapestry for a new kind of academy. Of course, it isn't as simple as just telling the stories. There's still the hard daily work of creating real change on the ground. To do that, we have to be smart and strategic, because part of our job is to carefully deconstruct the prevailing institutional narrative, start pulling on those loose threads, if you will. As you know, that narrative is a very tightly woven and a very powerful force for preservation of the status quo. It resists tampering. It's adverse to change. But its pocket also holds the key to those doors we've been trying to open so we can change what's inside. On one level, it takes rules and policies and enforcement. It takes leadership from the top. But that's just the scaffolding, if you will. What I'm talking about is something more. We can add diversity requirements to the curriculum, or create new sexual harassment or hate speech policies, or add new categories to the equal opportunity statement, or change admission requirements. We can fix problems as they arise, but that's not what it's all about. It's about making diversity intrinsic to our everyday work. It's about institutionalizing the work so that diversity is not contingent on this or that person or program or policy, or dependent on top-down institutional executive leadership. What we need to build from within is a diversity infrastructure, or actually something more organic, a dynamic, sustainable, mission and values-driven living system that is the crucial part of the lifeblood of any institution. And creating that infrastructure takes dedication, stamina, courage, and perseverance. It takes deep self-reflection and an open, courageous, no-holds-barred assessment of your values and mission. It takes a deep and honest understanding of who you are and who you want to be. It takes a high tolerance for frustration and sometimes even pain. But it also takes courage. When the going gets tough, we just can't walk away, as some of my allies do on a regular basis. We have to stay together and keep our eyes on the prize. And remember how good it felt to compete, to finally achieve a task? Speaking of a prize, it also takes a bold vision for where you want your institution to be in 10, 20, and even 50 years. And it requires a roadmap for getting there, with the key to getting around and through the roadblocks, slippery slopes, dead ends, hairpin turns, and other road hazards. I like to drive. We need to be pretty good drivers. And to be sure you stay on course, it takes an innovative, values-based, mission-driven, strategic agenda for change, which I think you have, and a deep commitment to turning that agenda into action that will move you toward your goals and yield measurable outcomes. Finally, it takes community of purpose and effort. And what I mean by this is a belief in and dedication to real collaboration across whatever differences might get in the way. Not a top-down structure, but a sense of shared responsibility for and shared dedication to this work. And I think it's important to remember that this community spills beyond individual campuses. All too often when we think of when you do research on medicine, it's not just for Fresno. It's going to affect what happens in Illinois, right? Any kind of study. But diversity is not thought in a national kind of a context. It's thought of institution by institution, and we need to move beyond that. It's about creating a national conversation. What happens at Fresno will affect my college. If you don't graduate diverse students, who will I have for faculty in the future? And vice versa. And so we have to change the conversation. It has to be different. Not just looking at this within the context of your own institution, but regionally, nationally, if not internationally. We often talk about our institution's goals as if we are in competition with every other college and university for students, for faculty, for recognition of excellence. But if we are indeed global in our work, it's important that we all work together in this journey toward transformation, and that we share our knowledge and perspectives, our best practices, our stories across institutional, disciplinary, cultural, and geographic boundaries. Diversity is not a zero-sum game where you lose if I win. It's an urgent national priority in a nation where people of color will be the majority by 2050. The message we need to deliver to all of our constituents and stakeholders is that diversity in higher education is a national economic as well as a moral imperative. We can't have real economic recovery without economic and social justice. And if we don't harness our institutional energies around equity and diversity, our institutions will be neither just nor sustainable. We will all lose, and winning begins in community. I can't help but reflect again on the history of diversity in the academy. Not a very long history, but a very consequential one. I think about where we began, when diversity was just barely on the institutional radar, a blip on the screen. And I think of the struggles and breakthroughs that brought us here. My own path to this point and career has been very much a natural extension of the journey I started decades ago. I have to confess that when I first left my Mexican-American home as the first in my family out of 300 cousins to go to college, I never ever considered the possibility of a presidency in my future. Higher education was a very lonely place for this Chicana, especially when I was the only Chicana graduate student at the University of Iowa. But I wasn't as alone as I thought. When I threatened to go home to California, return to California, my mother convinced me to stay. She said, "Rusty, where there's one Mexican, there's probably another one." She was right, of course. There were many others like me, struggling in Iowa to find their place in the world. I just needed to find them. And as the years went on, there were more and more of us in the borderlands of the academy, excluded because of our race and ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and gender expression, and disabilities. It was in those borderlands that I found a sustaining community beyond my family of origin, and it was there that I found my life's work. And as our numbers grew, we bridged our own differences of identity and cultural heritage to build communities of shared purpose. We found common cause in our struggle to gain access and legitimacy. And as we've done that, we challenge the institutions to rethink everything, from curriculum and pedagogies, academic standards, reward systems, to student service models, disciplinary structures, research methodologies, and even classroom design. I can assure you that the academic enterprise is the core and the foundation of diversity work. And the faculty are the creative and intellectual force behind everything that we do. Diversity research across the disciplines frames, supports, and advances our work on behalf of equity and inclusion for faculty, staff, and students. And it gives us the research data and the conceptual and scientific grounding that are so essential to the credibility and sustainability of this work as diversity educators. Because the academy is rooted in principles of academic freedom, one of its core principles is the free exchange of diverse ideas. And yet, higher education does not easily embrace cultural diversity, especially if it means embracing alternative systems of knowing and being that fundamentally challenge the institutional culture and its traditions. In fact, the academy has been very resistant to deep structural change and has not been very receptive to these voices. Our climb toward access and legitimacy has been long and steep. And yet, as diverse scholars and educators, have always been in the business of creating change. And in doing this work, we're creating change not only in our disciplines, but across the universities and higher education, because we're bringing new cultural filters and knowledge systems and critical perspectives to the study of everything from biosystems to social and political systems, from the built environment to the human body. In fact, we're doing the most important work that can be done. We're putting institutional values, assumptions, and systems of power and privilege under a multicultural microscope and looking at what it means for us to be who we are both individually and collectively in relation to our natural and built environments. We're asking fundamental questions. Who are we? What are our responsibility to ourselves and to each other and to future generations in our short life on this planet? How do we create new systems for an equitable, inclusive, and sustainable world? What is education for, and what is it that our institutions are obliged to do? No questions are more important. We've been asking these questions now for close to 40 years. Now, ever since we first arrived in the scene, the interdisciplinary programs we created that were mentioned earlier, like African American Studies, Chicano Studies, Women's Studies, broke new ground by exploring race, class, gender, and sexuality and systems of power and privilege through an integrative scientific, artistic, and humanistic lens. And they were the precursors of and models for the kind of interdisciplinarity and civic engagement that are now staples of academic life at universities throughout the country. Interesting. Their content, conceptual structure, methodologies, and theoretical foundations infuse research, teaching, and learning throughout the academic enterprise today. And yet, as you know, we don't get recognized for our transformative work. And as we fought an uphill battle for legitimacy, in part because our work has been considered more political than educational. The good news is that people aren't so surprised to see us anymore. We have some agency and standing in the academy, but the prevailing understanding of academic legitimacy still isn't all that different from what it was a few decades ago. If it were, we would be present in far greater numbers, and we would all be on the fast track to promotion and tenure in leadership positions. We created ethnic studies, feminist studies, GLBT studies, and disability studies. We created cultural resource centers. We changed admission priority policies and student learning outcomes. We brought new cultural perspectives to the disciplines, to pedagogies, to the curricula, to hiring and reward systems, and to administrative structures and processes. In short, we began the long, difficult process of transforming the academy, and we're not done yet. All of this has prepared me well for my current job. The presidency can be a lonely place, but the communities I have built are still critical to me, and I continue to build new ones, both personally and professionally. Those communities and their shared stories of struggle and dedication are my lifeline. And even though my portfolio of responsibility has expanded, the work of my life advancing equity and diversity in the academy is central to all of it, from facilities management to athletics to faculty hiring to admissions and academic progress. And indeed, this work has probably never been more important to me. I look back and I know that we've accomplished was unimaginable when we began, but countless challenges remain, including the increasingly ferocious backlash that is gripping our country. But I'm optimistic, sort of. Our real challenge, I think, is to move beyond the rhetoric of diversity to truly embrace difference in everything we do, so that it's not just a word on a website or in a planning document, but a lived experience in the everyday lives of our campuses, so that it's integrated into practice as well as theory, so that it impels individuals in personal attitudes and behaviors as well as collective and institutional action, so that the change is systemic and institutional, not a course here and a faculty member there and a new policy over there, so that its leadership is shared and its structures fundamental and sustainable, not subject to political and economic winds or vulnerable to the departures of people who have been its dedicated champions. Far too often over the years, I have seen leadership voids and stalled initiatives because all of the responsibility has rested on the shoulders of one key, highly placed person. In fact, when I left the University of Minnesota, it took them 3 years to replace me. It doesn't take 3 years to replace a provost. It doesn't take 3 years to replace a vice president for student affairs. These positions are held differently. Once that person leaves, the momentum is lost, and the institution reverts to business as usual. Funding dries up and diversity programs are mainstreamed. And for all intent purposes, diversity disappears from the radar, leaving behind nothing but good intentions, a smattering of good efforts here and there, and a host of unmet needs. So the challenge, in short, is to reimagine diversity as fundamental to everything we do and who we are in the academy, and then to act on that. And I can't help but note that as resistance and backlash gather steam, it played out in the Olympics, in the football game. You know, that big football game with the Coke advertisement? You know, it's more important than ever that we be able to both measure and articulate the results of our work, and I think that's something that we need to do more of. We need not only good data, but also powerful stories of equity and diversity in action, the lived experiences of our students, our faculty, and staff. And we also need good research on outcomes to back us up, to demonstrate that diversity is indeed contributing to the greater good of our institutions and our communities. From long experience, I can tell you that the period of cultural and economic transformation will be with us for a long time. You know, despite a recent reprieve by the appeals court, you know, affirmative action continues to be attacked every day, is under siege. The opportunity and achievement gaps are growing, and the backlash against new immigrants continue. People are scared, and they're looking for scapegoats, and they're naming the usual suspects, while at the same time claiming that we live in a post-feminist and post-racial society. The impact on us and our institutions of today's uneasy political climate is profound. I see more than ever how important it is that equity and diversity be deeply embedded in our institutions. And we simply cannot tolerate in isolation, institution by institution. Whether you're a diversity officer, a chief executive or financial officer, an administrator, a student, a faculty member, or member of the larger community, whether your ancestors came from Europe or Asia, Africa, or Mexico, whether your college is old and established, Eurocentric, or like mine, indigenous and Hispanic serving, we must all work together to form a critical mass of influence to shape decisions and investment priorities nationwide. And here's why. Nationally, as institutions struggle to balance their budgets, institutional leaders like me are on the lookout for any unit or program that is underperforming, wasteful, or non-essential. They're looking for savings that won't diminish their stature and cut into the core mission or erode excellence as it is currently defined. And diversity programs, for a host of reasons, often end up either mainstreamed and assimilated, that is to say, dissolved, or in shreds on the cutting room floor. So we are challenged as never before to demonstrate the critical importance of this work. That's especially important as we are subjected to ever higher levels of scrutiny and held to ever higher standards of accountability by funders, students, and families looking for returns on their investment, and by a public impatient for measurable change. And because the proof, as they say, is in the pudding, our work be truly transformational, not just business as usual. There's a lot of talk about institutional transformation these days, as I said earlier, in the context of a new normal. But frankly, in all of my travels, I haven't seen all that much. Many of the changes we see simply replicate existing traditional models that make diversity not integral, but incidental. By default, they perpetuate systems that marginalize and delegitimize diversity teaching and research in the academy. Beyond the usual austerity measures like hiring and salary freezes and program cuts and consolidations and revenue-producing measures like tuition increases, I see lots of business as usual. And even when diversity is named a priority, it often gets little more than a commitment and a link on the homepage of a website, or a full paragraph on page 5 of a planning document. It's considered a good thing in good times, but too costly in bad times. And so the new normal is real, just themes and variations on the old. You know, as hard as we've worked to change such thinking, diversity continues to be viewed as political, not educational. And maybe you think that my talk is very political. And it's often considered a drain on resources, not as an investment, despite the fact that it is one investment that is certain to make our institutions stronger over the long haul. And here's the new reality. Our institutions simply aren't going to survive in these difficult times without something far more radical than a cut here and a realignment there. What we need is a fundamental shift in consciousness toward a vision that truly embraces diversity as a core value and also as an everyday mindset. That means putting diversity on par with other academic priorities and making the case so that everyone understands the benefits, including economic recovery and institutional sustainability. In the end, what we do now may do more for the sustainability of our work in our institutions than anything that we have ever done before. Some of us in this room have spent a lifetime learning to straddle and mediate worlds and tolerate ambiguity and contradictions. And that's good, because there's never been a more critical time for us to bring that new consciousness, if you will, to the academy as a creative and transformative force. So just what does it take to put this new consciousness to work? To summarize, let me go over again what I believe are the key steps. First, we dispense with the notion that faculty, student, and staff interests are separate. They're not. any more than institutional and community interests are. They're all interrelated. A diverse curriculum, one that truly reflects and engages our many knowledge systems and cultural traditions, must go hand in hand with inclusive, culturally sensitive pedagogies that engage every student in the academic conversation, and with diverse faculty whose teaching is grounded in good research and deep understanding of a multiplicity of difference. At institutions where equity and diversity are lived as core values, diverse students, faculty, and staff climb the learning curve together, teaching and learning from each other. But where diversity is an afterthought, the learning curve is steep and a slippery slope for those who live outside of the dominant culture. Second, are you all interested in this? Because I can go someplace else. Okay. Second, we understand that this is not about race or gender or sexual. I'm just checking. You know, it's not just about race or gender or sexuality or class or disability or other category of difference. Our work must recognize the intersectionality of identities and address the interlocking systems of bias and exclusion and their impact on our institutions and our lives. Third, we change the conversation. We develop a new set of rules and a new agenda for institutional transformation, and we do it together. We stop getting mired in disagreements. Instead, we find consensus across these differences. We step up. We make sure that we agree about priorities and that those shared priorities are always at the top of the institutional agenda. And our first and most fundamental premise is this: we cannot afford to ignore diversity or make it anything but a core value. Fourth, as we gather critical mass and more of us move into places of positional authority, we resist the temptation to become so fully assimilated as insiders that we forget who we are and who and where we come from. Diversity often is disruptive, and that makes it a powerful catalyst for change. Where everyone thinks alike, there is only status quo. And whether we're talking about social justice, human rights, or the economy, we cannot afford to perpetuate the status quo. And fifth, we recognize that we need to be the ones making the proposals and finding creative ways to do more with less. In other words, we all lead, every one of us, wherever we are in the organizational chart. Because this is so important, I'd like to say a few more words about leadership. As a Chicana president at a Hispanic and Indigenous serving institution, I am more challenged than ever to live one of my cardinal priorities, that being in a position of formal institutional leadership doesn't mean turning away from my deepest self to preserve the system that put me there. It may seem that as a president, I'm the consummate insider, but I know that I didn't get here by being an insider, playing an insider's game. I always have known that we couldn't work with integrity or advance our agenda by squeezing ourselves into the same old institutional boxes. In fact, I need more than ever to maintain the edge of critique that has always been at the core of my work, doing what requires constant vigilance and self-reflection. I've always said that this work begins at the most personal level, and this has been my true test, being a president. My job as a president is to bring everything I've got to the challenges of mapping my college's course into the decades ahead, and to do this in a way that recognizes the new normal for what it is, a shifting and slippery baseline for institutional transformation. So I can never stop asking myself these questions. How do I infuse into this role the principles and ideals of inclusivity and social justice that I hold so dear? How do I build the diverse communities of shared responsibility that can make this work? How do I build integrative structures around multiple identities and continue to be a bridge across intersectionality marginalized groups? How do I continue to ensure that all voices are at the table, representing the complex identities and roles of people at my college? I know the proverbial buck stops with me, but I can never stop asking, how do I occupy a position of institutional authority without simply being an authority figure and without being overwhelmed and co-opted by the system that I was hired to change? Transformational leadership is leadership that challenges institutions to rethink everything. I still have my job. From curriculum and pedagogies, academic standards and reward systems to student service models, disciplinary structures, research methodologies, and even classroom design. The result is a dramatic reconfiguring of our institutions for everyone, new ways of doing business, and I just want to say something else. So what do we do to turn this around? First, let me say once again that this time of crisis is also a time of opportunity. These times demand new ways to do things for new ideas and new directions. And that's where I'm relying upon these young people who are still in the room. When I hear people say we need new ways of doing business, I say absolutely. When they say we need new conversations at the disciplinary intersections, I say absolutely. When they say we need global perspective, I say of course we do. But then I want to ask, where is domestic diversity in this? Why do our concerns often get subsumed within interdisciplinary perspectives and global perspectives? Why do our institutions position global education as an educational asset while persisting in the belief that domestic diversity or multicultural education is a distraction or a problem to be fixed? Why do our concerns get sidelined as women's issues or race issues or identity politics when no one ever seems to question the legitimacy or centrality of global perspectives? Why does the Academy privilege the contributions of international students and faculty while continuing to devalue African American, Latino, Native, feminist, GLBT, or disability perspectives? Why are diverse domestic populations expected to assimilate or even disappear, even while internationals are thought to contribute so much, including their intact identities and knowledge systems? Why? Why not both, not either or? If we are truly committed to innovation and institutional change, we need to harness the cultural assets of every single one of this country's historically underserved and underrepresented populations, as well as its international populations. I went to elementary school in France and high school in Panama. I understand this and I appreciate it. I can say this. And we need to create spaces where we can achieve intercultural understanding and consensus around a shared agenda without demanding the cultural assimilation of one or more cultures by a majority culture. We will create a truly multicultural academy only through a dynamic, and I have said this many times, only through a dynamic, ongoing process of reevaluating the structures of knowledge, the patterns of relationships, and the organizing principles of institutional life. Translation. No more silos, no more marginalizing of diversity work, no more entrenched systems of exclusion and privilege. Through such a process, we can shape a new agenda that will close the educational achievement gaps, I believe, create spaces for new kinds of leadership and problem solving, and move us forward toward inclusive and sustainable systems of higher education grounded in equity, social, and economic justice. Working together, we can create what my dear friend Gloria Anzaldúa called the multiplicity that is transformational. The work is not for the faint of heart. It is difficult, but it is also gratifying. Indeed, it begins and is rooted in a passion for justice. It also begins in community, not in isolation. The importance of moving out of our institutional and cultural silos cannot be overstated. Again, active dialogue is critical in what we're trying to do. What I worry about is when we come to these events, we go back to our individual spaces and work as usual. You know, how do we sustain this work? And I think I'm just going to stop there. Well, let me say this. You know, one of the other things, and this is really important, you know, we need to also bring new generations into the conversation. I'm getting old, folks. If we want a new kind of future, that future needs to be in the room. Those of us who are veterans of this work must not only mentor emerging leaders, but also listen and learn from them, as we did in the student session today. Those young people will critique and rethink what we have done. They will talk back to us. We may not always like what they have to say, but we need to get out of their way. Once we move on, they need to find their own way to continue our work and shape the agenda for the world that they will eventually lead. And I will stop on that note. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. I was requested to do a song. Are y'all up for one? I write music. It's cheaper than therapy. I always tell groups that. So actually, I'm going to write a song. I'm going to sing a song that I wrote, and I actually did at Keeping Our Faculties Conference, and I was encouraged to do it again. I have many little ditties, but this one I think is geared to today. I was trying to write a song for Norma Cantu, who is retiring from the University of Texas, San Antonio. And the theme of her retirement party was doing work that matters, and I was struggling with it. It was also about the time the Dreamers were getting repapered, right? And they were interviewing, and the TV was on, listening to the news, and they were interviewing this young man in Houston, and he was all hot from the sun was beating down on him, they were getting sunburned. And I remember the reporter asked him, so what does this feel like? And he said, it's like stepping out of the shadows. And that's what this song is about. Oh, I broke my fingers. So we'll see how I do. I just can't do a G chord yet. Pardon? Oh, that's a good idea. I am not a performer. Those of you who know something about music, just bear with me, okay? We'll get through it. Can you hear me? How did I ever get to be where I am, right? It's not tuned, but it's okay. Woke up this morning feeling mighty fine. Sun was shining through my mind. Birds were a-humming, grass was green below. Then I heard my spirit whispering oh so low. What you gonna do? What you gonna say? Will you turn your back and walk the other way? The sun began burning, young people in line, stepping out of shadows, hoping they'll be fine. You read it in the papers, you heard it in the news, but did you really listen to their blues? What you gonna do? What you gonna say? Will you turn your back and walk the other way? The wind began blowing, clouds were gathering too. When it started raining, I was wondering what to do. So I picked up my guitar, I started singing songs. It's my way of praying, and I pray that it's not wrong. Oh, what you gonna do? What you gonna say? Will you turn your back and walk the other way? Well, now that I am older, been thinking what I'd done. Did it really matter? And I hope I had some fun. I don't know the answers, I'll leave that up to you. You can tell my story, but know that I'm not through. So what we gonna do? What we gonna say? Will we turn our backs and walk that other way? Thank you all very, very much. I don't know if there's any questions.
Rusty, you have been phenomenal. President Castro, thank you so much for agreeing to have us do this diversity forum, the first under your leadership. It's been a wonderful day for those of us on the PCHRE that have been through all of the journey of the morning through the lunch to the panel to this brilliant keynote speech, and of course the lovely entertainment. It's been tremendous. At the PCHRE, we have left you some evaluation forms. We would really appreciate it if you could give us some feedback and some comments. This is our first time out with an event like this, the whole day that is, and we know that there's always room for improvement. So we'll be looking for that feedback. We'll be sharing that with President Castro and hoping to do another diversity forum in April with another keynote speaker to begin to address these ideas around chief diversity officers and what does that look like in a Fresno State or a university like us. Are we ready for that? Are we prepared to move forward and make that commitment? So there's still a lot of important work to be done, and we very much thank you for participating and joining us today. We do have a couple of minutes. Rusty said she would agree to take any questions, if there's any questions from the floor. Yes, Anthony.
Hi, I'm Anthony Forrester, the University Controller here at Fresno State. I deal with the money, so this is a money question. If I won the Powerball tonight or tomorrow night, $400 million, and I was going to give you $100 million, tell me and explain to me what's the finish line look like, and how do you measure that for diversity and equity to get that $100 million?
We wouldn't be having good discussions like this, that people would be surviving, doing their work, free of any bias, etc. I mean, that, and it takes money to do that because it's about teaching, it's about bringing in diverse faculty, and just getting people to work together. I mean, that's to me what that finish line looks like, is where everybody feels comfortable and welcomed in any institution in the country, and that is genuine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming today. Please come up and say hello to Rusty as we conclude our afternoon. And there'll be another event this evening at 7 o'clock, part of Fresno State Talks. Thank you very much. You are welcome.